Alright you guys, so tonight we're going to start assembling the engine for Project Lightning Bug. I tore apart all the parts I need off the old engine, cleaned them up. I didn't want to bore you guys with that. I figured you guys would be more focused on watching the assembly of the new engine. So let's get started and we'll go from there. Alright you guys, pardon getting my midsection in here, but you're not going to see my head. On the naturally aspirated engines, you have a shorter oil filter adapter. On the turbo models, you have the longer version. The longer version is approximately 4 to 5 inches long. This is for the turbo application because you have an oil cooler. It just threads into the block, and a pair of vice grips. If you need to save it, vice grips will pull it out. Quite simple. Then the other thing, difference between a turbo motor and the NA engine is right here. On here you have a coolant feed line, I believe, unless I'm mistaken. I'm pretty sure it's a coolant feed line. So you're going to want to take this nipple out of here. Oops, pardon me guys. You're going to have this little nipple for the coolant. Let me see. Coolant passage. So that's got to come out, and there's a plug on my old block that I have to pull off and put in place. So, now we're ready to accept the cylinder head. I'm going to get my gasket out. We're going to lay the gasket on top of the block, and then we're going to get the head out of storage and set it on here. And we are going to torque to spec per ARP's guidelines. Alright you guys, so here is the head gasket from Mahle. I don't know if I pronounced that right, M-A-H-L-E. It's an MLS gasket, multi-layer steel. It only sits on the block in one fashion. And it just slides down over the head studs. Now we get this sitting down here. Next we'll take the head, we'll set the washers inside the head like I showed you in the previous video. And then we'll slide the head and washers down over the studs. Then we will finger start the nuts, and then we will torque them down to spec. Let me grab the head and we'll get started. Alright, so we have our cylinder head sitting over here with the washers already sitting in their location. ARP recommends we tighten this to 90 foot-pounds in 3 stages. So I'm going to do 30, 60, 90. And they recommend we put some lube on the fasteners. Normally it comes with its own little bit of lube, but I had a buddy of mine who needed it for an engine he was trying to finish up, so I just bought a tube of it. So to coat the threads in a little bit of lube, and then we'll set the head on. Now, my game plan is to run these studs hand tight initially. Once they are hand tight, then I will torque them to spec. There is a torque sequence on the Protege head, and it goes from the center of the engine, outward in sequence. So now we're going to carefully lift our head up and set it in place so it exists, or so it nestles on top of the block. Now you want to be careful, you don't want to damage the head gasket, and you don't want the washers to shift. But I've heard a lot of guys who said they've had to clearance these to fit the ARP studs and whatnot on here. Now I didn't have that issue. And got a problem, guys. The gasket popped up and didn't sit accordingly with the dowel pins. And this is what I say about taking time and making sure things go smooth. So, I got no secrets. I'll hide all my mistakes with you guys because this is the first engine I've put together in a long time. The last one I did was an FE block with my old man. So, now, here's a tip that I didn't realize. There is a certain way this has to sit on or else it won't clear the dowels for the block. Or to locate the cylinder head. I'm going to block your camera view for a minute so I can set this down on here. And as I said, you want to set this down carefully, not to disturb the washers. So now we have the head sitting on the gasket. We are going to tighten this down. These are 13 millimeter nuts. They're 12 points. So, and I have a thin wall 3/8 drive socket that fits. It's tight, but it works. Now, I am on the opposing side of this block for the simple fact that way you guys can see what I'm doing. We had one washer that didn't want to sit right. And this is why I see people clearancing their heads. This problem right here. And my fat sausage fingers don't fit. So, yeah, here comes the head again. And now that I put a nut on there, it won't come off. This happens, guys. Well, snag after snag. Now the washer that fell off is jammed in the head. So I've got to carefully work it out of the way so we can lift this puppy back up and resituate it. Now you still want to be careful when you're doing this because you don't want to cause any damage to the head gasket. And we're going to have to fish this out. I like to tell you everything goes smooth, but it doesn't. And if it did, this wouldn't be fun to watch, right? I'll be right back. I'm getting the magnet. So, and this is what I was telling you all to be cautious about. I was actually kind of interesting that this happened, but the washer went down in the head and got stuck. And now we're going to fish it out. So, you know, y'all, give me a second. I'll be right back with you guys. Alright, you guys. I told you from day one of making these little DIY videos that I was never going to hide anything. One washer did not sit right, and it fell into the head. 15 minutes of hunting it down, shaking the head around, and trying to find it. Here we go, relaying all the washers. Now, as I stated before, you guys want to make sure you use extreme caution when doing this, because, like what just happened to me, these things like to not sit where they need to go or stay. And then we end up with chasing a washer down inside these head cavities, and it is a real pain in the backside to get it fixed. So, what was going to be a let's build this all in one night before bedtime type video is going to be spread out over a couple days because we are now way behind where I wanted to be tonight. So the focus tonight is going to be getting the cylinder head situated, getting it torqued down, so that way we don't forget where we left off, and go from there. So once again, I'm just putting all my washers in place. I've heard numerous guys say they've had head clearance problems, as I keep saying. Personally, test fitting, I didn't, so we're going to go through with trying this by hand. And yet again, I dropped another washer. This is a royal pain in the backside, but at least this one just fell in the cylinder, or in the hole. So, make sure you guys pay attention to what you're doing and not get distracted. Alright, so we have all the washers laying down. The threads are still have ARP sealing on it. We're going to sit this head down the correct way. I almost tried putting it on backwards. And I know I'm blocking your shot, but I will get you guys there in a second. Alright, all the washers are seating down. Cylinder head is sitting flat and secure. Now we'll go ahead and put our nuts back on. So there is a torque sequence from ARP, and there are 10 head studs on this engine. We will start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And like I said, we're going to get all these bolts started, and then we'll worry about torquing them down. I've got a new ratchet I'm dying to try. My dad has told me for a long time now I need to get with the times and get more into electric or pneumatic tools. I haven't wanted to spend the money just because they're not exactly affordable for a single income household when there's 3 kids that have to be taken care of. I will do everything by hand if I have to. It's the way I was raised. And just as times change, so do the mechanic methods. So right now, I've got almost all the nuts started. And if I can get these all started here now, then we'll be good to go. Now, y'all can hear I'm still not 100% from being laid up with my asthma attack, but they said I could cough for weeks after this, so we'll just deal with it. So, all the bolts are started. I'm going to grab an extension for this so I can use it with my ratchet. Now, I'm not going to run these down tight. I'm just going to let them kiss the cylinder head in the sequence it's supposed to be torqued. So that way, at least it's sitting secure. So it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm trying to get this upside down, y'all. Sorry. So if I lay it out in sequence like it's sitting here, this is ARP's directions. It's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're going to get these all snugged, at least hand tight. get a torque wrench on these, and we're going to do them in sequence. Now, like I said, you don't want to gun these down. You just want them to kiss the head, so that way you get a starting point for your sequence. If you gun them down, you're going to ignore the torque sequence and ignore what you're supposed to be doing. Okay. All right. And yes, I am using the torque sequence cheat sheet. All right. All right. So we are roughly hand tight, and I don't want to go any further than that. I'm going to grab my torque wrench, and we're going to take this down to sequence. Now, Mazda has some goofball torque specs. They're like torque to yield specs, and ARP doesn't use them. So we're going to add a bonus to the fact of going to ARP studs is the simple fact that if I pull this head, I can redo it later or reuse it later. So we're going to set our torque wrench to 30 foot-pounds. We're going to torque them all down to 30 first. And then we're going to do it in a step. We're going to do it in 30-pound increments. I have my cheat sheet. This is how I know, because I'm doing it upside down so you guys can see the head. We are going to, I'm trying to hold the engine stand with my leg. Okay. And you just follow the numbers on the torque sequence. So, we're going to go to, like I said, 30 first. Alright. Now up to number 4. You go upside down, we'll screw you guys up. I know this isn't exactly the most thrilling thing to watch. Ooh. And this is where you run into problems sometimes. Alright, you guys, my camera kicked us out, but I left off on bolt number 6. And he's still on 30 foot-pounds. We'll go to number 7. And just shows you how loose these were for my electric ratchet. We go to number 8. And then number 9, which is the furthest bolt back. And then number 10. And this will click, or end the first round of torque specs. Now we're at 30. Now I'm going to take my torque wrench and take it up to 60. You guys don't have to use a click style or a fancy torque wrench, but it does help. So we're going to start back on cylinder number 1. And this is going to get a little interesting. Try to hold it steady, but. And then we're going to go to cylinder 2, or bolt 2, I mean. And then we're going to go to 3. And then 4. You guys know the numbers. I shouldn't have to count for you. I feel like freaking the count on Sesame Street. And then dart over to 5 over here. I'm sweating like a pig, y'all. And go down to 6 from 5. Go to 7. Eight. Now, you guys can use OEM replacement bolts, but remember they are torque to yield, so if you ever have to pull the head, one and done is basically all for them. Now we are on a final torque setting of 90 foot-pounds per ARP stud directions, and we are going to go back and start all over again. Now, this is going to get a little more tricky because you guys are like, John, you've been doing this 2 times now. You can't remember the sequence. I just don't want to mess it up. So it's easier to have it right in front of me and guarantee it's going right and make sure we're doing it right. All right. And then seven and 8. 7 is the lower corner over here. All right, and then 8, 9, last bolt. There, torque to spec. Now, don't forget to zero your torque wrench out before you store it. The next step will be putting on the main bearing support plate. I don't want to put the cams on yet. I want to wait till I get the bottom end covered up, and then we will get it all finished up from there. So that's the cylinder head torque. Alright, so we got the head torque down, 90 foot-pounds. That's only for ARP head studs. The factory torque specs are different. I think it's like 15 foot-pounds, and then turn 90 and turn 90. I'm not 100% sure. So, the oil pump, we're going to start with that. I'm going to make a gasket with some ultra gray gasket maker, and I have this Edelbrock gasket cinch. I use gasket cinch on a lot of paper gaskets and O-rings because it holds them in place without destroying the O-ring or the gaskets. So I'll be using this on a couple O-rings that glue against the oil pump, against the block, and be using this to make my actual gasket. This ultra gray says it needs to sit about an hour for it to cure before you can torque it to spec. Oil pump torque specs are 16 foot-pounds. So if you don't have a 3/8 drive foot-pound wrench, you can always use an inch-pound. Just take your 16 foot-pounds times it by 12, you get 192 inch-pounds. So let me get this gasket made and go from there. So we're going to just take this. You guys can see here, it's got a line in it you guys could trace. Now, a lot of people say use the OEM gaskets or the OEM oil pump. I wasn't going to pay that kind of money for it. Instead, I went with a Melling unit. Melling makes good products for small block Chevys and Fords. They make good oil pumps, so I figured we would go with that. It was good enough for a Chevy or a Ford small block V8. It ought to be good enough for a 4-cylinder Mazda. Well, only time will tell. So I'm going to get this. I'm not the best at gluing stuff cleanly. Now the other thing you want to make sure you do with this is when you put down your oil pump on the crank, it clocks a certain way. It'll only fit on a certain way because your crankshaft actually drives your oil pump. Guys, give me a second. I didn't cut this enough to get a smooth bead. So, I'm not a huge fan of RTV personally. I use it because I have to, because I don't make gaskets for this. But if I had my choice, I'd use a gasket and gasket cinch all day long. It's just, to me personally, it's held up better over time. Something my dad always used, and something he's kind of instilled upon me to work with. Now you could use a dab of silicone to hold the O-ring in place, but I don't want to go that route. So now when you put this on initially, you want it finger tight for about an hour. And this is where things get a little messy. So you guys can see I have sealant. Now I like to smooth it out a little bit. Try to make sure I cover all the places it needs to be. That way we don't get any leaks. I would hate to put this motor together and have to deal with an oil leak. And it just so happens that the gasket maker sits right where the O-ring is. So I'm not, on the oil pump I decided I probably don't need to use gasket cinch on it, but on the water pump we will. So you want to make sure you get a nice even coat on it. Then before we put this on, and I've already done it by this stage, you want to make sure you put some oil on the gasket that goes around the crankshaft. You don't want a dry seal, or else it could tear the seal. So now you guys can see we have a nice even coat. Like this. Okay. Now what I did is, let me take my gloves off real quick, y'all. What came in this kit for the Melling oil pump, you have 3 O-rings. The smallest is for your dipstick tube. The medium goes between the block and the oil pump, and the large goes between the oil pump and the main bearing support pan. So we're going to go ahead and take this off. We're going to get the medium O-ring out now, because the medium O-ring goes between the block and the oil pump, so that way it seals. Carefully push it down and in, making sure it sits flat. Alright, now that I've taken my gloves off to show you guys this stuff, let me show you something else. So I can remember how all the bolts were oriented on the block. I used my old oil pump to hold the bolts in place. We're going to set this on top of our head. Now you guys notice this whole time I'm doing this, we have the head covered. I want to keep dirt as much as I can out of the engine. One little grain of dirt, hair, anything can destroy an engine. Let me readjust my camera here so you guys can see the block. And if you guys look, I'm going to bring you in here. You see the crankshaft is around here, but if you go to the top side right here, it's flat, and on the bottom side it's flat as well. That is to drive your oil pump. If you look here, it's flat here and flat here. That way, once the crank spins, your oil pump spins as well. So let's get this thing situated. I'm gonna get a fresh pair of gloves on, and I really don't want to make a mess. So now that we're situated here, you guys get a beautiful view of my gut while I'm doing this. We are going to hand tighten the oil pump bolts. Hand tighten for about an hour. If you're in a colder climate, maybe a little longer. So we are going to take our oil pump, and like I said, I wasn't going to spend the money on a big pump or a name brand pump or a OEM pump. I mean, it didn't seem cost effective to me when Melling has had good luck with high performance V8s. Ought to be able to handle anything 4-cylinder makes. So now we are sitting on the block, and we are sitting firmly against it. We are going to take our old pump, and we're going to just match the bolts up where they came from. You just, like I said, hand tight, and then in an hour we'll torque them down. You guys can see I have this pump here for reference. And if you guys can't get your hands in here like I'm running into now, just grab a deep socket and drive it in by hand. So all of our bolts are in the proper orientation. Now I'm going to grab my 12mm deep. And actually, if you have a speed wrench, you can use that too. Speed wrenches work nicely. Electric ratchets work well. My speed wrench is the wrong drive size for what I need this for. So we'll just hand tighten these up. Well, apparently my camera stopped recording after about 9.5 minutes of me putting on a water pump, making the gasket, everything else. So what I did was hand tighten the bolts using the socket and my hand without a wrench. I ended up having a speed wrench that fit the drive I was using. So the next thing we're going to do is get our water pump, which we bought from Gates. I've got the gasket right here, came in the kit, and then we have our Gates water pump. I'm going to use some gasket cinch around the edging to glue the gasket to it. Then we'll put the gasket put glue on the opposite side of the gasket, put this on the block, and torque it to spec. Alright, y'all. So, gasket cinch. I showed you, it's made by Otto Brock. Used to be made by Mr. Gasket. So it's kind of like PVC glue. It comes with a little wand. So what you do is, you'll take your water pump, and all you do is trace around all the holes. Make sure you get it nice and evenly coated. It's not going to matter too much in the long run. It just works as a glue. So here I have gasket cinch all the way around. You guys can't really see it, it's clear. We take our water pump gasket and just lay it even centered on the pump. Like so. And see, look, it glues it on there. Pretty self-explanatory. So once we get all that situated, you want to make sure the gasket lines up. Now the gasket's on there, we're going to put glue on the other side of it. And I'm spilling some on the ground, but oh well. Like I said, I learned about this stuff from my old man. He swears by it. I've used it quite a bit, and I have had pretty good success with it. So I'll stick to it. If it fails me, then I'll look at alternatives. So, what I was trying to say is, see, the whole gasket's coated. Now, let me aim this down here. You guys can see where the water pump goes here. And it goes on a certain orientation. And just like I did with the oil pump, I left the bolts in the old pump so I knew exactly where they came off of. So what we're going to do is orient this accordingly on the water pump, or on the block. Like so. And then we take our bolts that are in current setup. Sorry guys, I had to look at the pump because it's sitting on top of the oil pump and it threw me off. Make sure we're still recording because my camera likes to shut off after a while. So we've got these bolts here, all in location. Now we'll take our torque wrench, as I said, 16 foot-pounds. A 16 foot-pounds isn't very much, you guys. So don't try to crank the living heck out of it, or else you will break the bolt off in the block. But I just go around in a clockwise formation, or clockwise rotation. We can get our idler pulley on tonight. I'm not ready to put the cam on yet. I got to get the engine to TDC, so that way we make sure we do all this right. And then I want to put the idler pulley on tonight only because the idler pulley sits right here, and that bolt also secures the gasket down. So alright, water pump's torqued. Now let me get the idler pulley out and find the hardware for that, and we'll go from there. Alright, so now we have our water pump on. The last bolt for the water pump also shares a bolt with our idler pulley. Idler pulley's right here. You guys can see how it has kind of a lip to the backside against the block, or lip to the block, or in this case actually against the water pump. We have our bolt. It's a 14mm head. This gets torqued from 27 to 38 foot-pounds. So we are going to torque it to 35. I guess I can go all the way to 38. Probably wouldn't hurt. So, got my little torque wrench here, and it's actually set for 38. 3/8 drive. Should be good enough. And it's torqued. So now our water pump is fully secure. The next few bits are going to be torqued down the oil pump. That's got to be 16 foot-pounds. Then we're going to actually probably end the video here. So the front is pretty much done, minus the head, the cams, and the main support bearing. In the next video, we're going to flip the engine over. I want to get the engine to the top dead center. I want to get the support pan and the oil pan on and sealed, and then we can get the cams put on and then set the timing belt. So let me fast forward a little bit so that our TV sits, and we'll torque that down and call it a night. Alright you guys, so this has been sitting an hour. We're going to torque it down to 16 foot-pounds just like we did our water pump. 12mm bolt head. Now, after you torque this or you let it sit for an hour and you torque it down, you should let the RTV cure for at least 24 hours before adding any oil to it. Alright, now our oil pump is torqued down. The next thing I'm going to do is install a knock sensor and a plug where our oil coolant tube went, or feed tube for the turbos went. So I'll show you that real quick. You can see you have a hole here and a hole here, and this is where your coolant tube went. Let me see if I have it sitting here. This is what was in the block before I put a plug in it. This is for the turbo, the Mazda speeds. So we screwed this in. If I get it close up right here, there is a copper washer behind it to seal it to the block. And the knock sensor just goes into a dry hole. It picks up harmonics off the engine and relays it back to the computer. Now this hole right here is for our engine oil sending unit, oil pressure sending unit. I'm going to leave that open for right now, and there's a reason for it. Everybody says to get oil pressure built up in these engines, you're supposed to just disconnect the fuel pump fuse and crank it over till oil pressure builds up. If you ask Melling, they use a pressurized system to force oil into all the block orifices so you don't have a dry startup. Now, and that's on their LS engines, because the LS engine has a crank-driven oil pump like this does. Now, I'm not spending $300 on a pressurized system. My goal will be to get the engine assembled, the whole front drive, the belts assembly, and I'm going to take a motor oil bottle with an 80-90 nipple, lay this block on its side, and force oil in there as best as I can. And then we'll make sure we put some assembly lube up in here in all the cam journals. And go from there. I think this thing is turning out sick. I do have some parts off of powder coat, and we will get to see that here shortly. Started losing my voice at the end, y'all, so I just wanted to say thanks for watching and God bless.